So I'm Steve Heaton. I work for Natural England as an advisor in the Tree Action Plan delivery team. So that's the Tree Action Plan is really meeting tree planting targets across the country. The government has set quite ambitious targets. So Natural England's job within that is really to make sure that we're planting the right tree in the right place, so that we're not planting them on top of other priority habitats and things like that. So my job is mainly to look at proposals and comment on them and make sure that they're right, really. But I also do a proactive element of that, which is where my interest in willows comes from, really. So yeah. So just a brief introduction to willows. This is just the willows, the genus, well, they are the genus Salix, and the Salicaceae family worldwide has about 56 recognised genera. But in the UK, we've got two genera, which are the willows and the poplars. So poplars, there's only really, off the top of my head, two native poplars, the black poplar, which is quite rare, and aspen, but there's lots of other planted poplars like the Lombardy poplar and things like that. And then we've got willows. So within the UK, there are native willows and introduced willows, and they have a bit of a reputation, or certain ones have a bit of a reputation for being tricky to ID, particularly because they have a tendency to hybridize. And two of the willows in particular I'm going to talk today are quite tricky because they're very similar and they also hybridize, which makes it even more difficult to ID them. Willows in general cover quite a lot of growth forms, from really big trees to the sort of size of an oak tree to some of our smallest woody plants in the world almost, really. So certainly within the Dales, we've got dwarf willow on the hilltops, which is just a tiny little alpine that grows little more than 5-10 centimetres tall, if that really. It just creeps on the floor. They also grow in a range of habitats, from sort of by the sea in the sandhills and dunes, all the way up, as I've already said, to the top of mountains and everywhere in between. They're generally associated with wetlands, though, but they do grow in all sorts of different habitats. And the other sort of thing about most willows, I think there's one species of willow that grows in the Amazon or somewhere, which has male and female flowers on it, but generally the male and female plants are separate, which particularly when you're talking about rare willows is a sort of an issue, because as willows become rarer and populations become more spread apart, the chances of them pollinating becomes less, so that's a bit of a problem. I think I'm ready for the next slide. So in the Dales, the sort of landscape that we see today, where we got lots of open countryside, it hasn't always been like that, and certainly I'm not a vegetation expert going back through the ages, but there are pollen records in the Dales that show that large parts of the Dales were, after the Ice Age, colonised by birch and willows. Particularly willows would have been mainly on the watercourses and the streams and wetter areas. And then over time, other trees moved in, like hazel, and then there were climatic changes over that time where peat bogs formed, and well, I'm diverging into a different topic now, but so basically, as people started to move into Britain and we started to use the land for different uses, farming, and we've sort of that's the main reason really why willows and other wooded habitats have declined across the country, really. And we've got a long history of using willows as well. So we have introduced quite a few willows to the country that have been around for a long time. So I might use the term archaeophyte in a bit, which basically means a plant that's been, was introduced probably by humans a long time ago, before the 1500. I think it's the year 1500, and so between like the Neolithic period and 1500, really. Anyway, so yeah. So what are willows? Willows are great. Well, I love willows, and my garden is mainly willows of all sorts of things. Because what I didn't tell you when I was introducing myself, before I worked for Natural England, I used to work as a consultant field botanist. So I did vegetation survey work over most of northern England and lots of Scotland as well. So I got to see quite a lot of interesting habitats, particularly doing rare plant monitoring of upland willows and montane willows in Scotland. But willows are great for a number of reasons. That they really support biodiversity. They're good for nature recovery. They good for natural flood management. They can also use to help farming more sustainable. And all these four things all go together hand in hand, really. So if we, and there's a lesser, I forgot, lesser tortoiseshell on a willow. So we can go on to the next slide, I think. So this is just going a bit more detail in what I just said on the last slide, really. So willows, for biodiversity and nature recovery, willows are used by over 750 different species of insect. Over 200 of those insects only use willows, and in some instances they only use particular species of willow as well. So all those insects go into the food chain, so they're also really important for loads of things that eat insects and things that eat those things that eat insects. But they have really interesting mycorrhizal associations in the soil, so there's lots of fungi associated with particular willows as well. And they can be used to restore habitats as well. So scrubland, we need more willow scrub. Within wood pasture habitats, willows can really play a dominant role. From a wetland restoration point of view, willows can be useful as well. And wet woodland, as part of my job, I'm always looking to try and create more wet woodland, because to get it into sort of a national state where it's in a good condition, we need more wet woodland across the country as a whole. They also are really important for creating diverse, resilient landscapes, particularly in the face of climate change. We need habitats and just general ecosystems that have more woody structure to them for a number of reasons. Well, supporting other wildlife, capturing more carbon, excuse me, and just other things like just creating more shade and things like that we need, as part of my looking at willows and hopefully trying to get more willows into the wider environment, they can be used for a more approach to creating like habitat restoration in general. So in the dales on the PT tops, we're doing lots of peatland restoration. There's the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, Natural England are doing peatland restoration, but also we need to be looking at these ecosystems as a whole, and not just looking at one. So on the edges of peat, when I've been doing survey work in Scotland, I often see on the peaty slopes, I've seen eared willow and things like that holding the peat together. So they can be really useful for a wide range of things like that. Also, another thing is there's a lot of quite low growing species, which might sound funny, but that's really useful, particularly in an upland setting when I'm looking at woodland creation proposals that maybe there's restrictions like breeding birds, particularly waders and curlews. We don't particularly want to increase the predator shadow by planting large woodlands, like big trees. So they can be quite useful for creating small woodland, particularly along streams and in gills and things like that. they also can be used for remediating polluted land and also wastewater, maybe coming, well, sewerage or off from created by farms and things like that. So yeah, there's just from a nature recovery and biodiversity point of view, willows have got lots of potential to be used in different ways. Next screen. So this is a bit more about natural flood management. As our climate is changing and we're getting heavier rain episodes, we need to look at ways to try and stop these major flood events by holding more water further up the water course and not rushing it away. So they can be used for planting along streams and water courses, creating riparian woodland, which in turn the trees can, they lessen the water going into the water course, but also they have a habit of falling down and holding water back. And also, I don't know, I've seen a few cases particularly in northern England, where we've been putting leaky dams into upland streams on slopes to try and slow the water down. But by planting willows around those leaky dams, in time, as the leaky dams break down, hopefully the willows can replace those and hold water onto slopes and just hold more water in the environment. So, and this picture here is actually, it's not from the Dales, I borrowed it off the internet, but it's somewhere where I went. It's a valley that I forgot the name of on the Isle of Arran. And above, this is eared willow, and above it there is a blanket bog, which was quite drained. It had been drained at some point in the past, but the eared willow was forming a layer on the slope below it, and where the eared willow was growing, it was holding water pools and holding water onto the blanket bog. And also there was ground flora starting to form with angelica and lots of other things growing beneath it, where on the other areas of the slope, they were much less biodiverse and the water was just draining off the slopes. So it's just trying to illustrate how willows can be really useful for holding water in the environment. I think that's ready for the next slide. Another thing, at the beginning of the year, I started working with a farmer who was really interested in willows mainly from an animal welfare point of view, and from she was really interested in dung beetles as well, and and traditionally willows were cut and fed to animals a long time ago, and one of the main things they help with is deficiencies. In particular, I don't keep sheep, but they can help with deficiencies in cobalt when you're weaning lambs, but also they are high in tannins and other ingredients that are really useful as a natural amphelmetic, so worming really. So and there have been trials in farms where some farms have put half their sheep on, they haven't given them any treatment, and half of them are being fed willows that they've grown around the farm in fences and things like that, or when they move sheep from field to field, they walk them past willows so they can have a quick nibble. And they've been shown to drastically reduce the amount of pharmaceutical chemicals that they need to control the worms in the sheep's gut, which has a knock-on, of course, that the dung beetle can then it doesn't get killed by the chemicals, and dung beetles are really important for our ecosystems in clearing up the dung and putting it into the soil where it can be used by other organisms and feeding the grasslands and other environments that they're taken down into. So by not killing the dung beetles or having a lesser effect on them, also it stops the dung from being just washed straight into watercourses and things like that if there's dung beetles around to deal with it. So that improves the soils, but also willows can be, and this is maybe more from a an arable point of view, they're starting to also grow willows on. You may have seen when you drive around the country, you have these short rotation coppice willows that are cut regularly. A lot of that goes into biomass, but they are starting to look at cutting it and chipping it and using it on the soil because it contains loads of minerals and nutrients that are really important for growing crops. And they've been trialling that and seeing that it's been really, it's having really beneficial effects to the soil rather than being reliant on chemical fertilizers. So they're just a number of ways that they can make that land use more sustainable. Next slide. This is my dog who loves sticks, and her favourite sticks are willow, and that's a bit of crack willow that she's playing with. But they've been used through history to make baskets and cricket bats. So white willow, which is, there are a few white willows around in the Dales. There's a particular variant of that may be a hybrid that's used to make cricket bats. But they've been used to make loads of things throughout history. So I can't think off the top of my head how many different things, but anyway, so what species have we got in the Dales? I'm going to talk about some of the common ones and then go into some of the more scarce ones. So these two are quite common, and you often see them in the lower parts of the Dales, so along the river bottoms in the valleys. So you've got crack willow, and that one's for a crack willow in Otley where I live, so it's not in the Dales. But they can grow to really big trees, crack willows, and they have long, thin leaves that have toothed edges, and they're sort of a bright green on the upper surface and a sort of paler green on the undersurface. And the branches do tend to crack, and the twigs in particular are quite cracky. And there are quite a few, it's quite a variable plant, and there are quite a few recognised variants of it. The other one that I see quite a lot driving around the Dales is what I call osier. And this is a shrub that grows quite quickly, and you can cut it almost annually and it'll grow back really quickly. And it's got long leaves that are green on the top, and they've got silvery, hairy underneath, and they're generally not really very toothed on the edge of the leaf. Both of these willows are archaeophytes, like I was talking about before. They were introduced quite a long time ago, and they're generally associated with human development or settlement or just along water courses. And the next one I'm going to show you, which is on the next slide, which I haven't got a photo of, mainly because I had a photo on my work phone and it's got civil service security and it wouldn't let me take the photo of it. So this white willow, it's quite a big tree, and it's a lowland species, so it's not particularly prevalent in the Dales, but you do see it around. And it has silvery white hairs on the leaves, particularly on the underneath of the leaf. They're long like the last two, and it's just quite a big tree, but I'm not going to focus on it too much because it's another archaeophyte, or not native tree anyway. So if we go on to the next two. So these are two of the really common native willows that you see in the Dales. Are grey willow, which can be a small tree or a shrub. It has broader leaves than the other species I've just shown you. I have got some grey willow that we can look at later when we're doing the cuttings. And it has, it's quite grey, hairy underneath the leaves. And if you get the second, not this year's growth, but the year's growth before that as a twig and peel the bark off, it generally has ridges or striations on the woody bit underneath, which is a good way of determining it from goat willow, which is another really common willow in the Dales. And this has more, the leaves on this are wider and widest in the middle, and they often have a twist at the end of it, like at the tip. The leaves twist a bit, and this can be a shrub, but it's often a tree, and it seems to me that the further north you go and east, the bigger the goat willow get. Particularly, I've seen some in Morayshire in Scotland that are as big oak trees, but you don't see them that big in the Dales. But there are there's different varieties of it. Both these willows grow in wet areas along rivers or just wet fields they can grow in. But they also are quite good sort of pioneer tree species, so they will colonise open areas. And in fact, in urban areas, you often see when someone's knocked down a building, they can be one of the first woody species to appear because the seeds are so light and flow in the wind and land on like the bare open concrete, and there's cracks and they germinate. So but you also see them in a wide range of habitats, really, not just wetlands. So next. So now we're getting on to, because one of the main reasons I'm talking today is because we're hoping to get more willows grown in the Millennium Trust's micro nurseries. So we've been talking about ones that would be good to get in, particularly ones that are difficult to get from commercial tree nurseries. And this is sort of the first one I'm going to talk about, where hopefully we can start propagating them. This is bay-leaved willow. It's a really pretty, I think it's pretty anyway, small tree or shrub. It can be a shrub, but it's quite often a small tree that grows along watercourses. It's got these really beautiful, dark, shiny like leaves that do look a bit like bay leaves. And some people claim that they can smell an aromatic smell. I've never smelt that. And so the other thing that's different from the two that I just showed you, goat willow and grey willow, is this will flower and come into leaf at the same time in the spring, whereas grey and goat willow, they flower first and then come into leaf. And it also has little glands at the base of the leaf, so sort of just up here, there's tiny little spots that are the glands that help with identifying it. And it's green shiny green on the top surface, and a slightly less shiny green on the surface. It's a northern species, so northern England going into Scotland, but it's sort of lowland as well, so you don't get it up in on the high hills. So it's more of in the valleys, in the dales, and sort of lower wet pastures. You might see it occasionally. And it's one that's virtually really difficult to get to plant in. For if you wanted to plant it in a wet woodland proposal, or to plant something appropriate to the dales in a wood planting scheme. So hopefully we can start propagating it. And the next one is another really pretty willow. This is one that's got quite narrow leaves, like the early ones I showed you. This is purple willow, and this is a really common willow along watercourses and, rivers in the valleys of the Dales. I see this all over the place. The picture here is at near Grassington, so it's not particularly close to here, but it's a little rocky island in the middle of the River Wharfe where the willow is growing. It typically only gets like 2 meters tall, probably 4 at a max, but generally it's about 2 meters tall. And it has the long thin leaves, which are sort of bluey green, and they're often, the leaves on the stem look like they're opposite each other. In fact, they're slightly sub-opposite, so one's slightly higher up the stem than the other. But most other willows, the leaves are alternate up the stem, so they don't have them opposite each other. So if you look at the picture over there, you can see that the leaves on the stem are almost opposite each other. And it has purple flowers in the spring. It's really pretty when it's in flower. And that's another one that's really difficult to get hold of for putting it in wet woodland planting schemes. So hopefully it's another one that can be propagated within the micro nurseries. And next one. So another willow that I think should be a lot more common in the Dales, but I don't see it very often that much. Although I've noticed that managed to collect, Eva and was it Liz managed to collect some ear willow from Ingleborough, so that's quite good. Yeah, particularly when you look at hillsides in the Dales and you've got sort of wet, rushy areas, I often think there should be a few eared willow popping up in those areas. That'd be really nice. So it's a shrub that doesn't really get much taller than 2.5 meters, has smallish, crinkly edged leaves, and it has stipules, which are leafy, well, they're these bits here. They're like leafy bits at the base of the leaf stem. And they're what I think people call the ears on the eared willow. So it likes more, tends to like more acid ground. So although we've got a lot of limestone in the Dales, so we have got acid, wet areas and moorland and sloped boggy edges. That tends to be where it should be growing, and does sometimes grow, as well as just in wet woodland. It's quite common in open wet woodland. Again, this one is available in nurseries, but it generally it's not of Dales local provenance, so it'd be really nice to start propagating from plants that grow in the Dales that get seed and cuttings growing from it. It's not rare, it's really common, but it would just be a nice one to grow. Yeah, next one. So creeping willow is a plant that's quite variable. It can often be like low growing creeping, but it can get into a sort of small upright shrub as well. It has small leaves that have silvery white hairs on the underside. And it grows in quite a wide range of habitats. It grows in sand dunes by the coast. It grows in dry, sandy heathland. It grows on I can't think of the word. Limestone pavement. It grows on limestone pavement. In fact, me and Eva saw it on some of the pavement on Ingleborough. And it grows in wet habitats as well. I've seen it growing in blanket bogs and on the edge of blanket bogs in the Cairngorms and places like that. So, and it's kind of patchily spread throughout the Dales. I wouldn't call it common at all, though, and it would be a nice one, another one, nice woody plant to grow and try and propagate to put in sort of appropriate like planting schemes. So it doesn't grow within woodland, though. It's an open habitat kind of shrub. And so this is dark-leaved willow. It's not a very good photo, unfortunately. And this and the next one, which is tea-leaved willow, are very, although when I describe them, they're going to sound quite different. They're incredibly difficult to tell apart, and they do really commonly hybridize as well. So dark-leaved willow is generally a small tree or shrub. It can get up to 5 meters high, but it can also grow into little shrubs that are 1/2 meter high and just never get any taller, so it's quite variable. It generally has sort of thin leaves that are described as sublustrous or dull, and they tend to blacken as they die or get bruised. Its twigs are a dull green and usually pubescent. Hello. And it has the leafy stipules like we saw in eared willow. They are quite persistent, so they sort of stay on throughout the year. In a lot of willows, the stipules can fall off through the season as the plant grows. And this is a plant of riversides, streams, edges, and damp slopes on hills. It's not very common in the Dales. It's quite scarce. I think it's just been, as we've managed the land for farming and things like that, it's just sort of disappeared from a lot of the landscape. It is generally an upland species. And this is one that likes a bit of calcium, so it tends to avoid acidic soils. Again, a bit like the bay-leaved willow, it's a northerner, so we're sort of on the southern edge of its range, although I believe it does grow in Cambridgeshire or somewhere like that as well, but generally it's a northern plant. And it potentially is under-recorded. Certainly as I've been driving around the Dales over the years, I've seen a few places where I keep meaning to go back because I think I've seen it, and on occasion when I have gone back, I've managed to find it. And again, this is another one that is really difficult to find from tree nurseries. The Woodland Trust have it in their tree guide to trees and planting woodlands, but you can't get hold of it. It's quite a light demanding species, so it needs to be grown in areas where it's not competing with bigger trees. So that's dark-leaved willow. And I think this is my favourite of the willows that grow around the Dales. And again, it's quite scarce, and it is very similar to dark-leaved willow, but it typically doesn't get as tall as dark-leaved willow. It has leaves that are generally shiny and leathery, quite thick, and the twigs are more of a glossy, and they are pubescent earlier in the year. They've got downy hairs on the twigs, but they tend to fall off quite early and become shiny, and they're shiny dark brown, yellow, or even, well, red or even yellow. And the underside of the leaves is a glaucous white, which is true of dark-leaved willow to quite an extent as well. Again, this is one of stream sides. It's one that I often imagine you should see more on the upland streams in the open hillsides. But you're often when you do find it in dales, it's more on bigger streams that have edges where animals can't quite graze all of it, so it manages to grow over the water. But it also grows on ledges, on hills. It's really sort of upland species. I've seen it on the sort of peaty bog sides of Loch Maree in northwest Scotland. When you get flushed alkaline areas next to the peat, it will grow on the edge of peat as well. So it grows on a sort of a range of habitats, but generally where there's a bit of an alkaline influence. Again, this is one that we're quite keen to grow and get more planted around the Dales, so it'd be a good one to get growing in our nurseries. Because it's virtually impossible to get hold of from commercial tree nurseries. So next, willow. Okay, so we're on to dwarf willow already. I've been racing through them. So this is probably one of our most scarce willows in Yorkshire, but it's more common in Scotland because it's a real alpine plant. It generally grows on mountains over 600 metres. It's really suffered from sheep grazing, I think, in the Dales on the tops of Ingleborough and hills like that. So it's really rare. There's not many recent records, although I was just told that they've found it on Pen again recently, which is nice. And it grows on exposed rocky summits and slopes, and in short alpine turf with grasses and sedges, often with a sedge called stiff sedge, which is Carex biglowii, which is a real sort of hilltop sedge that you quite often see on the tops of mountains. And as you see, it really is quite a short, small, cute little plant, really. I took that photo on the west coast of Scotland somewhere, I can't remember where. And again, it'd just be I know that Wild Ingleborough are hoping to grow it in their nurseries, because it would be a nice one for hilltop rewilding projects to try and get more dwarf willow around. So this is sort of, as I was talking about, I have to think about what we really need in the Dales, and looking at some of the species I'm talking about that are quite scarce is we need areas where we can put more upland willow scrub where tea-leaved and dark-leaved willow can grow. And this is larger picture here is a picture along a river where you can just see sort of some, I think, well, that was tea-leaved, but there was also dark-leaved on that site. Growing along the edge where it's just managing to get away where it's not too grazed. So it'd be a nice one to put. I'm helping with a tree planting scheme near Apperset, just outside of Hawes, where they've got the Yorkshire Dales River Trust have got a small area that's fenced off along an upland stream. So they're hoping to plant it there and form some willow scrub there, mainly with tea-leaved and hopefully dark-leaved willow as well. And so yeah, the upland willow scrub is largely missing from our English uplands, but something as part of my role, I'm hoping to try and create more around in the uplands, particularly in the Dales. And the next slide is because I quite often get asked about other montane willows that grow, that people read about and get excited about. So in Scotland, I've been lucky enough to go and monitor quite a lot of different willows that grow on mountains up there. They're generally really rare and most of them grow north of Glasgow, so they're quite a long way from home to be put in the Dales. But this isn't really a scrub species. This is net-leaved willow, which is a low-growing willow, sort of alpine of limestone. The one with the red flower is whortle-leaved willow, and then the one with the round leaves in the bottom corner is woolly willow, which is one of our rarest willows. And then the one, I'm getting my left and right, in the left bottom corner is downy willow. And this is one that I think potentially, as we hopefully can restore habitats, maybe it's one that could be assessed as maybe a potential introduction to the Dales. It may have grown here in the past a long time ago. So downy willow, it grows in the southern uplands of Scotland, as well as the highlands of Scotland on the hills. Also grows on Helvellyn, although until they reintroduced male species, male plants there were only female native ones left, so it was had almost gone extinct. But I look at downy willow and think maybe maybe it's one that we could consider reintroducing at some point. I'm not saying we do it now. I don't think we've got the habitat for it, and also there would be a big debate around climate change and how that is affecting the Dales to see where, because it would be very southern for it, and it would be sort of real sort of hilltop thing, well, not hilltop, sort of rocky ledges. But I just thought I'd include those because I often get asked about montane willows, and I do like talking about them. So the next slide is, if you're really interested in hiding willows, there's a main book that the BSBI, the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland, have published, is their handbook number 4, which is Willows and Poplars. And I think it's only, well, you can probably get it on eBay or somewhere for less than 10 quid, but I think to buy it new, it's not much more than that. And it covers all the native species and mostly introduced ones, and talks about the hybrids as well. I really enjoy the website, the Willow of Northern Europe, or Willows of Northern Europe, sorry. It's got all are nice upland willows, and lots of exciting ones that grow in Norway that have never been here. But it's really nice to look at and read about the willows. And another one, a good source of information, particularly for propagating willows like tea-leaved and dark-leaved, is the Montane Woodland Action Group. It's based around Scotland, so it does talk a lot about the species they've got up there, but it's just a nice source of information. There are other books on willows, but I think the SBI one's a good introduction if you're trying to learn ID. So I'm going to move on to a little bit about propagation before we start doing cuttings.
They all look so different. What do they have in common that makes them a willow?
Maybe my pictures make them look more different than they are, but they all have produced the sort of classic willow flower, like the classic pussy willow flower. I'm trying to think whether there's a real. They probably. That's a good question. Why? To me, they all look quite similar because they've got, although they've got different growth forms, they've got a very similar structure to them. The flower, if you were to look at the flowers, they're very, very similar. The flowers, they may have different numbers of like male anthers and things like that, but the structure's quite. I think it's more, but the taxonomy is more based on the flower structure, and now. I guess now we're getting more into DNA. There'll be people looking at the DNA of willows to figure out particularly how they're related, particularly things like the hybrids and dark-leaved and tea-leaved willow and things like that. Has anyone else got a question?
Any particular diseases?
Well, they do get lots of rusts and fungi, and lots of things love growing on them. As far as I know, they're not particularly susceptible to like we've got ash dieback and things like that. They don't seem to have things that have moved into the country that I know of that are particularly impacting willows. There may be insects and bugs that have come into the country that enjoy eating them. But they do have a lot of, I mean, from a garden point of view, sometimes growing a willow you can get things on it that visually impair it, but from a wildlife point of view, all these fungus and rusts are just part of it, really.
They're all deciduous.
Well, yes, most of them are. I think there's a few that aren't native to this country that are evergreen or semi-evergreen. They've got quite, and I know when I used to live down in Reading, and some of the weeping willows there almost had their leaves on all the way through the winter. I think it's because it was like a warm city environment, but generally they're deciduous, yeah.
You mentioned most of them were either male or female.
Yeah.
Are there any particular species there where there is a problem because there are only males left or something?
Well, I guess the downy willow that was growing on Helvellyn, because it was just on one or limited to a few crags and they were all female, there was no male in the vicinity. I think the nearest males were on the Merrick in the Galloway Hills, so they've had to take cuttings and introduce them. But some of the rare upland ones do suffer from particularly isolated populations where you've just got a single sex. That's where you struggle to get pollination then and seed produced, and they've become particularly rare, some of the ones in the montane ones, just because of the numbers of red deer in Scotland grazing. That's the other thing I've not really covered. Willows can be quite palatable and a lot of things enjoy eating them. Yeah.
So are these particular groups, say, for male or female, are they monitored? Do you know where they are?
Like rare willows, the S&H and other organisations, that John Muir Trust and people like that, will be monitoring, I'd imagine, and there are reintroduction projects for things like that in certain sites. And also in the dales, I think it's something I think about for the tea-leaved and dark-leaved willow, as I'm sure before human interference, there were probably a lot more dark-leaved and tea-leaved willows in the dales, and that the populations were all mixed, male and female. But as they've become smaller, there is potential that you get a population that doesn't have is a single sex, but they're not quite as rare as some of the montane ones, though.
Is there any disadvantage to growing them from cuttings rather than from seed?
Well, both methods have disadvantages, I suppose, and advantages. Growing from cuttings, I guess we're going to grow the exact genetic plant that we took the material from. At this time of year, taking cuttings, we're going to struggle to know whether they're male and female. So we're going to be reliant on collecting from different bushes and potentially hoping that we've got male and female ones. That then, when they're planted into places that there's a viable population where they can produce seed and reproduce. I guess there's the downside with growing them from seed is if you've collected the seed from the wild, you can never be sure that you're growing the pure species, that if you collect it off, because it could be hybridized with another willow. But seed also has the advantage of being able to produce trees much quicker, more, because you're reliant on cuttings. You're just growing one plant from a cutting. And you've only got a finite number of plants to take the cuttings from, which is why it'd be good to grow stock plants in the nurseries to take cuttings from rather than continue to take them from the wild, but also to produce seeds in cultivation. Although the seeds, as it says on there, they're viable for a really short period, so you have to collect them fresh and sow them.
Is it just the dark-leaved and tea-leaved that readily hybridize?
A lot of them hybridize, yeah. Tea-leaved and dark-leaved are notorious for hybridizing, and a lot of I've been struggling to convince myself when I've been looking at populations that are recorded as one or the other, that I'm not just looking at the hybrid sometimes, particularly for tea-leaved. I often come away thinking it's the hybrid rather than pure tea-leaved. But other willows do, like eared and grey willow really commonly hybridize. I've forgotten the name of the hybrid, but and you often see the hybrid of eared and grey willow on hillsides. It grows in similar habitats to eared willow.
Are they hybridizing by pollinators?
Yeah, they're generally insect pollinated. When I was growing up, for some reason, I always thought they were wind pollinated. I think a teacher must have told me that or something. But they're really important there's another reason why willows are great. They're really important for early pollinating insects. They're a great source of nectar and pollen. Yeah.
Do you know what the adaptations are that willows have that make them so successful in wetter ground? About them that makes things succeed?
Yeah, that's a good question. They certainly, when I look at the roots, they're really deep and they can be quite fibrous, and they go down into the ground. They seem to be able to, or a lot of the species, particularly the ones you see on wetter areas, seem to be able to cope with a lot more waterlogging and anaerobic conditions in the soil where there's not much oxygen or air in the soil. They seem to cope quite well with that. But off the top of my head, I can't think of any. I'm not as much of a willow expert as I'd like, because I'd like to know more about that myself.
Are willows a source of aspirin? Get it from all of them?
I think it is a general thing for most of the willows, as far as I know. They do. Is it salicylic acid? Yeah, it's one of the common things that most of them produce. Yeah, probably.
Effect on the sheep, I don't know.
Yeah, well, I presume animals animals do selectively graze things, and a lot of animals do like to graze on willow, and probably, as well as having like the like anti-worming and cobalt deficiency, there's probably lots of other nutritional and pain-killing benefits. Oh, well, so we're going to look at the willow things in a minute, but my experience of growing willows from cutting is if you take them in the autumn or the winter and stick them in soil, they generally root. But if you try and do it in the summer when they're really fleshy and they can be really difficult to get to root, and they need a lot of mollycoddling. But this time of year, hopefully, if we'll look at taking the cuttings in a minute, they should root. A lot of them should root quite easily. And the advantage of doing them in the autumn is while the soil is still warm, they can often root before the soil gets cold, and then they get away easier in the spring. So it's a good time of year to take them, really. And the sort of stems you want to take are sort of ripe hardwood cuttings. So this year's growth is okay, but if you've got some of the second or third year's growth, or like pegs of like older wood, they grow really well, easily as well. Yeah, hopefully as we get more plants growing, we can start collecting seed then, but it has its own sides. And I think the Ingleborough folk are probably more experienced at growing willows from seed than me. But yeah, I grow quite a lot of willows in my garden, and taking cuttings at this time of year is really, really good.